Reply to the fourth set of objections. I could not have hoped for a more insightful and at the same time a more courteous judge of my work, or for anyone more enterprising than the person whose observations you sent me. For he treats me with such considerateness that I easily perceive that he supports me and my cause, and yet he has considered in such careful detail the positions he opposes and has scrutinized them so carefully that I expect nothing remains that has escaped his keen intelligence. Moreover, so insightfully does he argue against those positions he judged to be less in need of proof that I have no fear that anyone should think he would have indulged me by hiding anything. Thus I am not so much bothered by his objections as I am pleased with his not having raised further objections. Reply to the first part, concerning the nature of the human mind. I will not take the time here to thank the distinguished gentleman for bringing the authority of St. Augustine to my aid, and for putting forward my arguments in a manner that suggests he fears they might not appear powerful enough to others. But first I will assert that where I begin to show how, from the fact that I know that nothing else belongs to my essence, that is, to the essence of the mind alone, beyond my being a thinking thing, it follows that nothing else really belongs to it. The passage in question is precisely where I proved that God exists. That very God, I say, who can bring about all that I clearly and distinctly know to be possible. For perhaps there may be many things in me of which I am as yet unaware. For example, in this passage I was in fact assuming that I was as yet unaware that the mind has the power to move the body, or that it is substantially united to the body. Nevertheless, since what I do notice is sufficient for me to subsist with it alone, I am certain that I could have been created by God without those other things of which I am unaware, and therefore that these other things do not belong to the essence of the mind. If a thing can exist without some other things, then it seems to me that the latter are not included in the thing's essence. And although mind is of the essence of man, still it is not, strictly speaking, of the essence of the mind that it be united to a human body. Mention must also be made of the sense in which I understand that a real distinction is not to be inferred from the fact that one thing is conceived without the other by an act of abstraction on the part of the understanding, inadequately conceiving the thing, but only from the fact that each of the two is completely understood without the other, that is, each is understood to be a complete thing. For I do not think an adequate knowledge of the thing is required here, as the distinguished gentleman assumes. Rather, the difference consists in the fact that an adequate knowledge of the thing necessitates there being contained in that knowledge absolutely all the properties that are in the thing known. And thus God alone knows that he has an adequate knowledge of all things. However, even if perhaps a created understanding really has an adequate knowledge of many things, still it can never know that it has this knowledge unless God were to reveal this fact in a special way. For all that is needed for the understanding to have an adequate knowledge of something is that the power of knowing, which is in the understanding, be capable of having this thing for an object. And this can easily happen, but for the understanding to know that it has adequate knowledge, or that God has placed nothing else in the thing except what the understanding knows to be there, it would have to equal the infinite power of God, and it is obviously self-contradictory for such a thing to occur. But now, in order to know that a real distinction obtains between two things, our knowledge of these two things need not be adequate, unless we were capable of knowing it to be adequate. But we can never know this, as has just been stated, therefore our knowledge need not be adequate. Thus, when I said it is not sufficient for making a real distinction that one thing is understood without the other, by an act of abstraction on the part of the understanding inadequately conceiving the thing, I did not think it possible to infer from this that an adequate knowledge is required for a real distinction, but merely a knowledge that was not rendered inadequate by us, through an act of abstraction on the part of the understanding. For it is one thing for our knowledge to be wholly adequate, a matter whose truth we can never know for certain unless God revealed it to us, and quite another for our knowledge to be sufficiently adequate for us to perceive that we have not rendered it inadequate through an act of abstraction on the part of the understanding. In the same way, when I declared that a thing must be understood completely, I did not mean that the act of understanding should be adequate, but only that the thing ought to be understood well enough to know that it is complete. I thought this was sufficiently obvious from passages both prior to and subsequent to the passage in question. For shortly before our passage, I had drawn a distinction between complete and incomplete beings, and I declared that for things to be really distinct from one another, each thing must be understood to be a thing and to be a being in its own right, and different from every other being. But later, upon declaring that I completely understand what a body is, I immediately added that I also understand that the mind is something complete. I took these two statements to mean the same thing. That is, I took understanding a thing completely and understanding a thing to be something complete to mean precisely the same thing. But here one can rightly ask what I understand by something complete, and how I prove that what suffices for a real distinction is that two things are understood as complete, with each of them being understood one without the other. Now, in answer to the first question, by something complete, I simply understand a substance endowed with those forms or attributes which suffice to let me recognize that it is a substance. For we do not know substances immediately, as I have noted elsewhere. Rather, we know them from the mere fact that we perceive certain forms or attributes that need to inhere in something if they are to exist. We call that thing in which they inhere a substance. But if afterwards we wanted to strip that very same substance from those attributes by whose means we know it, we would destroy all our knowledge of it. As a result, we could of course utter some words about it, but we would not clearly and distinctly perceive the meanings of these words. I am not ignoring the fact that there are certain substances that traditionally are called incomplete, but if they are called incomplete because they are incapable of existing alone in their own right, I confess it seems to me contradictory that they are substances, that is, things subsisting in their own right, and at the same time that they are incomplete, that is, things incapable of subsisting in their own right. But things can be called incomplete substances in the sense that they are seen in relation to some other substance with which they constitute a unity in its own right. Although insofar as they are substances, there is surely nothing incomplete about them. Thus, a hand is an incomplete substance when it is considered in relation to the entire body of which it is a part, but it is a complete substance when it is considered by itself. And in the same way, mind and body are incomplete substances when they are considered in relation to the human being that together they constitute. But if they are considered by themselves, they are complete. For just as being extended and divisible, having a shape, and so on are forms or attributes by means of which I recognize that substance we call body, just so, performing acts of understanding, willing, doubting, and so on, are forms by means of which I recognize a substance we call mind. Nor do I understand a thinking substance to be any less a complete thing than I do an extended substance, and there is no way anyone can maintain what the distinguished gentleman adds, namely that perhaps body is related to mind the way genus is related to species. For though a genus can be understood without this or that specific difference, nevertheless a species can in no way be thought without a genus. For we readily understand, for example, a figure without any thought being given to a circle, although this act of understanding is distinct only if it is seen in relation to some particular kind of figure, and it is of something complete only if it embraces the nature of a body. But we do not understand the specific difference of the circle without at the same time thinking of figure. But the mind can be perceived distinctly and completely, that is, to a degree sufficient for it to be taken to be something complete, without any of those forms or attributes by means of which we acknowledge the body to be a substance, as I think I have sufficiently shown in the second meditation, and the body is understood distinctly and as something complete, without any of the attributes that belong to the mind. Nevertheless, the distinguished gentleman argues here that even though some knowledge of myself could arise without any knowledge of the body, still one should not conclude from this that this knowledge is complete and adequate, so as to make me certain I am not mistaken when I exclude body from my essence, and he makes his point by means of the example of a triangle inscribed in a semicircle. A figure we can clearly and distinctly understand to be right-angled, even though we may not know or may even deny that the square of its hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of its sides. Nevertheless, we ought not on this account infer that there could be a right triangle, the square of whose hypotenuse is not equal to the sum of the squares of its sides. But as far as this example is concerned, it differs in many respects from the matter being discussed. For first, although perhaps a triangle can be taken in the concrete for a substance having a triangular shape, certainly the property of having the square of its hypotenuse equal to the sum of the squares of its sides is not a substance. Nor can either the triangle or this property be understood to be something complete in the way in which mind and body are so understood. Nor indeed can either of them be called a thing in the sense in which I used the term when I said it is sufficient that I could understand one thing, namely something complete, without the other, and so on, as is manifest from the remarks that followed. Moreover, I find in myself faculties, for I did not say that these faculties were things. On the contrary, I carefully distinguished them from things or substances. Second, although we can clearly and distinctly understand that a triangle inscribed in a semicircle is right-angled without noticing that the square of its hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the square of its sides, nevertheless we cannot clearly understand the triangle in which the square of its hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of its sides, without at the same time noticing that it is right-angled. But we can clearly and distinctly perceive the mind without the body, and the body without the mind. Third, although we could have a concept of a triangle inscribed in a semicircle, that does not contain the concept of the equality of the square of its hypotenuse, and the sum of the squares of its sides. Nevertheless, we cannot have a concept of the triangle such that no proportion between the square of its hypotenuse and the sum of the squares of its sides is understood to belong to this triangle. And thus, while we do not know the nature of this proportion, we can deny of the triangle only what we clearly understand not to belong to it. However, we can never have this understanding with respect to the proportion when it is one of equality. But obviously nothing that belongs to the mind is included in the concept of the body, and nothing that belongs to the body is included in the concept of the mind. And so, even though I asserted that it is sufficient that I could clearly and distinctly understand one thing without the other, and so on, one cannot on that account add, but I clearly and distinctly understand this triangle, and so on. First, because the proportion between the square of the hypotenuse and the sum of the squares of the sides is not something complete. Second, because this proportion of equality is clearly understood only in the case of a right triangle. Third, because a triangle can in no way be distinctly understood were we to deny the proportion existing between the sum of the squares of its sides and the square of its hypotenuse. But now I must declare how it is that from the mere fact that I could clearly and distinctly understand one substance without the other, I am certain that the one excludes the other. My explanation is that the very notion of a substance is just this: what can exist in its own right, per se, that is, without the help of any other substance. Nor has anyone who perceives two substances by means of two different concepts failed to judge them to be really distinct. Thus, had I not been seeking certainty greater than is commonplace, I would not have been content to have shown in the second meditation that the mind is understood to be something that subsists, even though absolutely nothing belonging to the body is ascribed to it. And I would have added nothing further in proof of the real distinction between the mind and the body, since we ordinarily judge that all things are related to one another. In fact, in the same way they are related to one another from the perspective of our perception of them. But because one of those hyperbolic doubts I put forward in the first meditation went so far as to make me unable to be certain about this very thing, namely that things are really such as we perceive them, so long as I was supposing that I was ignorant of the cause of my being. For this reason, everything I wrote regarding God and truth In the third, fourth, and fifth meditations, adds weight to the conclusion regarding the real distinction between the mind and the body, which I eventually completed in the sixth meditation. However, the distinguished gentleman declares that he understands a triangle inscribed in a semicircle without his knowing that the square of its hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of its sides. It is indeed the case that this triangle is capable of being understood even if no thought is given to the proportion that exists between the square of its hypotenuse and the sum of the squares of its sides. But it cannot be understood that this propos- I mean, it cannot be but it cannot be understood that this proportion should be denied of the triangle. On the contrary, in regard to the mind, we understand not only that it exists without a body, but also that all the attributes belonging to a body can be denied of it. For it is of the nature of substances that they mutually exclude one another. Nor does the distinguished gentleman offer anything in refutation of me, when he added that there is no cause for wonder if, when I conclude that I exist from the fact that I am thinking, the idea that I form in this way merely represents me as a thinking thing. For in like manner, when I examine the nature of the body, I find absolutely nothing in it that has the smell of thought about it. And there can be no greater argument for a distinction between two things than the fact that on turning our attention to either of the two, we discern absolutely nothing in the one that is not different from what is in the other. Moreover, I fail to see why it is that this argument proves too much, for to show that one thing is really distinct from another thing, nothing more can be said except that the one thing could be separated from the other through divine power. And it seemed to me that I took sufficient care lest anyone therefore think that man is merely a soul using a body. For in that very same sixth meditation, where I dealt with the distinction between the mind and the body, I also proved at the same time that the mind is substantially united to the body. And I do not recall having read anywhere any arguments proving this that were more powerful than the ones I used. And the person who claims that a man's arm is a substance really distinct from the rest of his body does not on that account deny that the arm belongs to the nature of the whole man, nor does the person who claims that the arm belongs to the nature of the whole man provide on that account any occasion for suspecting that it cannot subsist in its own right. In like manner, it seems to me I have proved neither too much, by showing that mind can exist without body, nor too little, by asserting that it is substantially united to the body. Since this substantial unity does not stand in the way of having a clear and distinct concept of the mind alone as something complete, and therefore this concept differs markedly from the concept of a surface or a line, which cannot thus be understood to be complete things unless depth is also ascribed to them, in addition to length and width. Finally, although the power of thinking is dormant in infants and disturbed, though surely not extinguished, in the insane, this fact ought not make one think that the power of thinking is joined to the corporal organs, in such a way that without them it cannot exist. For from the fact that we often experience our power of thinking to be impeded by these organs, it does not at all follow that this power is produced by them, and there are no grounds, or hardly any, on the basis of which this conclusion can be proved. Nevertheless, I do not deny that the close conjunction of mind and body, something we constantly experience within us, with ourselves, is the reason why we do not notice the real distinction of the mind and the body, unless we attentively meditate on it. However, in my opinion, those who frequently ponder what is stated in the second meditation will be easily persuaded that the mind is distinct from the body, and not merely by a mere construction or abstraction on the part of the understanding. Rather, it is known as something distinct because it is really distinct. I have no answer to give to the comments the distinguished gentleman adds here regarding the immortality of the soul, since they are not in conflict with me. But as far as the souls of brute animals are concerned, this is not the place to consider them. In addition, Unless I were to discuss the whole of my physics, I could not say more about them than what I already described in part 5 of the discourse on method. Nevertheless, lest I say nothing at all on the matter, it seems to me that what is especially noteworthy is that there can be no motion either in the bodies of brute animals or in our own unless absolutely all the organs or instruments are present, with whose help these motions could also be brought about in a machine. Thus, not even in ourselves does the mind immediately move the external members. Rather, it merely directs the spirits coursing from the heart through the brain and into the muscles, causing them to perform certain motions. This is because by themselves these spirits may be applied with equal facility to the performance of many different actions. But most of the motions that take place in us in no way depend on the mind. For example, heartbeat, digestion, growth, and breathing while we are asleep, and even while we are awake, such actions as walking, singing, and the like, since these latter take place in the mind without the mind taking any note of them. And when people fall from a height and extend their arms toward the ground to protect their head, they obviously do this without any advice from their reason, but merely because the sight of the impending falls I mean but merely because the sight of the impending fall extends all the way to the brain and sends animal spirits into the nerves in the manner necessary to produce this motion without the mind giving its assent, as if it were produced in a machine. And since we certainly experience this in ourselves, why should we marvel so if light reflected off the body of a wolf onto the eyes of a sheep were to have the same power to excite in the sheep the motion of flight? But now, if if we were to desire to use reason to determine whether certain motions of brute animals resemble those performed in us with the help of the mind, or whether they resemble merely those motions that depend merely upon the influence of the spirits and the disposition of the organs, we must consider the differences that obtain between them, namely those differences I described in part 5 of the discourse on method. For I do not think any others are going to be discovered. Then it will be readily apparent that all the actions of brute animals resemble only those of our actions, which take place without any help from the mind. Thus we are forced to conclude that absolutely no principle of motion in brute animals is known to us except the mere disposition of the organs and the continuous flow of the spirits that are produced by the heat of the heart as it thins the blood. And at the same time we will notice that up to this point nothing has given us an occasion for attributing anything else to brute animals except the mere fact that by not distinguishing these two principles of motion, when we previously observed that one principle depends solely on spirits and organs in brute animals as well as in ourselves, we unadvisedly believed that the other principle, which consists of mind or thought, also was present in brute animals. And obviously, whatever we were so convinced of from our youth, even if afterwards it be shown by arguments to be false, is still not easily removed from our stock of opinions, unless we give our attention to these proofs frequently and over a long period of time. Reply to the second part, concerning God. Up to this point I have attempted to refute the distinguished gentleman's arguments and to withstand his attack. From here on, as is the custom for those who struggle with those stronger than themselves, I will not place myself in direct opposition to him, rather I will dodge his blows. He brings up only 3 points in this part, and these can be readily accepted if they are taken in the sense in which he understands them. But I understood what I wrote in a different sense, which also seems to me to be true. The first point is that certain ideas are materially false. As I understand it, these ideas are such that they present matter for error to the power of judgment, but the gentleman, by considering these ideas taken formally, argues that no falsity is in them. The second point is that God is derived from himself positively, and, as it were, from a cause. Here, I had in mind merely that the reason why God does not need any efficient cause in order to exist is founded on something positive, namely, on the very immensity of God, than which there can be nothing more positive. This gentleman proves that God can never be produced or preserved by himself through some positive influence of an efficient cause. I too am in agreement with all of this. The third and final point is that there can be nothing in our mind of which we are unaware. I understand this with respect to operations, whereas the gentleman who understands this with respect to powers denies this. But let us carefully explain each of these one by one. When the gentleman says that if cold were merely a privation, there cannot be an idea of cold that represents it as something positive. It is obvious that he is merely dealing with the idea taken formally. For since ideas are themselves forms of a certain sort and are not made up of any matter, whenever we consider them in so far as they represent something, we are taking them not materially but formally. But if we view them not in so far as they represent this or that thing, but merely in so far as they are operations of the understanding, then we could surely say that we are talking. I mean, we could surely say that we are taking them materially. But in that case, they would bear absolutely no relationship to the truth or falsity of their objects. Hence, it seems to me that we can call these ideas materially false only in the sense I have already described. Namely, whether cold be something positive or a privation, I do not on that account have a different idea of it. Rather, it remains the same in me as the one I have always had. And I say that this idea provides me with matter for error if it is true that cold is a privation, and does not have as much as reality as heat, because in considering either of the ideas of heat or cold, just as I received them both from the senses, I cannot observe any more reality being shown me by the one idea than by the other. And it is obviously not the case that I have confused judgment with an idea, for I have said that material falsity is to be said in the latter, whereas only formal falsity can exist in the former. However, when the distinguished gentleman says that the idea of cold is coldness itself, insofar as it exists objectively in the understanding, I think a distinction is in order, for it often happens in the case of obscure and confused ideas, and those of heat and cold should be numbered among them, that they are referred to something other than that of which they really are ideas. Thus, were cold merely a privation, the idea of cold would not be coldness itself as it exists objectively in the understanding, but something else which is wrongly taken for that privation, namely a certain sensation having no existence outside the understanding. But the same analysis does not hold in the case of the idea of God, or at least when the idea is clear and distinct, since it cannot be said to be referred to something with which it is not in conformity. But as to confused ideas of gods which are concocted by idolaters, I fail to see why they too cannot be called materially false. Insofar as these ideas provide matter for their false judgments, nevertheless, surely those ideas that offer the faculty of judgment little or no occasion for error are presumably less worthy of being called materially false than are those that offer it considerable occasion for error. However, it is easy to exemplify the fact that some ideas offer a greater occasion for error than others. For this occasion does not exist in confused ideas formed at the whim of the mind, such as the ideas of false gods, to the extent that it does in ideas that come to us confused from the senses, such as the ideas of heat and cold. If, as I said, it is in fact true that they display nothing real, but the great occasion of all for error is in ideas that arise from the sensitive appetite. For example, does not the idea of thirst in the man with dropsy in fact offer him matter for error, when it provides him an occasion for judging that drinking something will do him good, when in fact it will do him harm? But the distinguished gentleman asks, what it is that is shown to me by this idea of cold, which I have said to be materially false. He says, If it shows a privation, then it is true. If it shows a positive being, then it is not the idea of cold. Quite true, however. The sole reason for my calling this idea materially false is that since it is obscure and confused, I could not determine whether or not what it shows me is something positive outside my sensation. Thus I have an occasion for judging that it is something positive, although perhaps it is merely a privation. Hence one should not ask what the cause is of this positive objective being that causes this idea to be materially false, since I am not claiming that this materially false idea is caused by some positive being, but rather that it is caused solely by the obscurity that nevertheless does have something positive as its subject, namely the sensation itself. And surely this positive being is in me insofar as I am a true thing, but the obscurity, which alone provides me an occasion for judging that this idea of the sensation of a cold represents something external to me that is called code, does not have a real cause, but arises solely from the fact that my nature is not perfect in every respect. My basic principles are in no way weakened by this objection. However, since I never spent very much time reading the books of the philosophers, it might have been a cause for worry that I did not sufficiently take note of their manner of speaking when I asserted that ideas that provide the power of judgment with matter for error are materially false. Had it not been for the fact that I found the word materially used in the same sense as my own in the first author that came into my hands, namely in Francisco Suarez, Metaphysical Disputations, dispute number 11, section 2, number 4. But let us move on to the most significant items about which the distinguished gentleman registers his disapproval. However, in my opinion, these things seem least deserving of disapproval, namely in the passage where I said that it is fitting for us to think that in a sense God stands in the same relationship to himself as an efficient cause does to its effect. For in that very passage I denied what the distinguished gentleman says is a harsh saying, and a false one at that, namely that God is the efficient cause of himself. For in asserting that in a certain sense God stands in the same relationship to himself as an efficient cause, I did not take the two relationships to be identical, and in saying by way of preface that it is wholly fitting for us to think, I meant that my sole explanation for these things is the imperfection of the human understanding. However, I asserted this throughout the rest of the passage, for right at the very beginning, where I said that there exists nothing about which it is inappropriate to inquire into its efficient cause, I added, or, if it does not have one, to demand why it does not need one. These words are a sufficient indication that I believed there exists something that needs no efficient cause. But what besides God can be of this sort? And a short time later I said that in God there is such great and exhaustible power that he never needed the help of anything in order to exist. Moreover, God does not now need a cause in order to be preserved. Thus, in a manner of speaking, God is the cause of himself. Here, the expression cause of himself can in no way be understood to mean an efficient cause. Rather, it is merely a matter of the inexhaustible power of God being the cause or the reason why he needs no cause. And since this inexhaustible power or immensity of essence is incomparably positive, I said that the cause or the reason why God does not need a cause is a positive one. This could not be said of anything finite, even if it is supremely perfect in its own kind. But if a finite thing were said to be derived from itself, this could only be understood in a negative sense, since no reason derived from its positive nature could be put forward, on the basis of which we might understand that it does not need an efficient cause. And in like manner, in all the other passages in which I compared the formal cause or reason derived from God's essence, on account of which God does not need a cause, either in order to exist or to be preserved, with the efficient cause, without which finite things cannot come into existence, I always did this in such wise that the difference between the formal cause and the efficient cause may come to be known from my very own words. Nowhere have I said that God preserves himself by means of some positive influence, as is the case with created things preserved by him. On the contrary, I merely said that the immensity of power or essence on account of which he needs no one to preserve him is something positive. And thus I can readily agree with everything the distinguished gentleman puts forward to prove that God is not the efficient cause of himself, and that he preserves himself neither by means of any positive influence, nor by means of a continuous reproduction of himself. This is the only thing that is achieved from his arguments. However, as I hope is the case, even he will not deny that this immensity of the power on account of which God does not need a cause in order to exist is in God something positive, and that nothing similarly positive can be understood in anything else on account of which it would not require an efficient cause in order to exist. This is all I meant when I said that, with the exception of God alone, nothing can be understood to be derived from itself, unless this is understood in a negative sense, nor was there any need for me to assume any more than this in order to resolve the difficulty that had been put forward. However, since the distinguished gentleman warns me here with such seriousness that there can scarcely be found a theologian who would not take exception to the proposition that God is derived from himself in a positive fashion, and, as it were, from a cause, I will explain a bit more carefully why this way of speaking seems to me to be extremely helpful and even necessary in treating this question, and also why it seems to me to be quite removed from suspicion of being likely to cause someone to take offense. I am aware that theologians of the Latin Church do not use the word cause, in speaking of divine matters, when they are discussing the procession of persons in the most holy Trinity, and whereas theologians of the Greek Church use the words cause and principle interchangeably, theologians of the Latin Church prefer to use only the word principle, taking it in its most general sense, lest from their manner of speaking they provide anyone an occasion on this basis for judging the Son to be less than the Father. But where no such danger of error is possible, and the the discussion concerns not God considered as triune, but only as one, I fail to see why the word cause should be shunned to such a degree, especially when we arrive at a point where it seems quite helpful and almost necessary to use it. However, there can be no greater use for this term than if it aids in demonstrating the existence of God, and no greater necessity for it than if the existence of God manifestly could not be proved without it. But I think it is obvious to everyone that a consideration of efficient causes is the primary and principal, not to say the only means, of proving the existence of God. However, we cannot pursue this proof with care unless we give our mind the freedom to inquire about the efficient causes of all things, including even God himself. For by what right would we thence include God before we have proved that he exists? We must therefore ask, with respect to every single thing, whether it is derived from itself or from something else, and the existence of God can indeed be inferred by this means, even if we do not provide an explicit account of how one is to understand that something is derived from itself. For those who follow exclusively the lead of the light of nature, immediately at this juncture, form a certain concept common to both efficient and formal cause alike. That is, what is derived from something else is derived from it as it were from an efficient cause. But whatever is derived from itself is derived, as it were, from a formal cause. That is, because it has an essence of such a type that it does not need an efficient cause. For this reason, I did not explain this doctrine in my meditations, rather I assumed it to be self-evident. But when those who are accustomed to judging that nothing can be the efficient cause of itself, and to distinguishing carefully an efficient cause from a formal cause, see the question being raised as to whether something is derived from itself, it easily happens that while thinking that this expression refers only to an efficient cause properly so called, they do not think the expression derived from itself should be understood to mean as from a cause, but only negatively as meaning without a cause, with the result that there arises something concerning which we must not ask why it exists. Were this rendering of the expression derived from itself to be accepted, there could not be an argument ratio from effects to prove the existence of God, as the author of the first set of objections has shown. Therefore, this rendering is in no way to be accepted. However, to give an apt reply to this, I think it is necessary to point out that there is a middle ground between an efficient cause, properly so called, and no cause at all, namely, the positive essence of a thing, to which we can extend the concept of an efficient cause in the same way we are accustomed in geometry to extend the concept of an exceedingly long arc to the concept of a straight line, or the concept of a rectilinear polygon with an indefinite number of sides to the concept of a circle, and I fail to see how this can be explained any better than by saying that in this query, the meaning of efficient cause should not be restricted to those causes which are temporally prior to their effects, or are different from them. For first, the question would be pointless, since everyone knows that the same thing cannot exist prior to itself, or be different from itself. Second, we could remove one of these two conditions from its concept, and yet the notion of an efficient cause would remain intact. For the fact that an efficient cause need not be temporally prior is evident from the fact that it has the defining characteristic of a cause only during the time it is producing an effect, as has been said. But from the fact that the other condition as well cannot be set aside, one ought to infer only that it is not an efficient cause taken in the strict sense, and I grant this. However, one ought not infer that it is in no sense a positive cause which can be compared by way of analogy to an efficient cause. And this is all that is called for in my argument. For by the very same light of nature, by which I perceive that I would have given myself all the perfections of which there is an idea in me, if indeed I had given myself existence, I also perceive that nothing can give itself existence in that restricted sense in which the term efficient cause is typically used, namely, in such a way that the same thing, insofar as it gives itself existence, is different from itself, insofar as it receives existence. Since being the same thing and not being the same thing, that is, being different from itself, are contradictory. And thus, when the question arises whether something can give itself existence, one must understand this to be equivalent to asking whether the nature or essence of anything is such that it needs no efficient cause in order to exist. And when one adds that if there were such a thing, it would give itself all the perfections of which there is some idea in it, if the meaning of this is that this thing cannot fail to have in actuality all the perfections that it knows, the reason for this is that we perceive by the light of nature that a thing whose essence is so immense that it does not need an efficient cause in order to exist, also does not need an efficient cause in order to possess all the perfections that it knows, and that its own proper essence gives it in an eminent fashion all that we can think an efficient cause is capable of giving to any other things. In the words, if it does not yet have them, it will give them to itself, are helpful only in explaining the matter, since we perceive by the same light of nature that this thing cannot now have the power and the will to give itself anything new, but that its essence is such that it possesses from eternity all that we can now think it would give itself, if it did not already possess it. Nevertheless, all these modes of speaking, which are taken from the analogy of an efficient cause, are particularly necessary in order to direct the light of nature in such wise that we pay particular attention to them. This takes place in precisely the same way in which Archimedes, by comparing the sphere and other curvilinear figures with rectilinear figures, demonstrated various properties of the sphere and other curvilinear figures that otherwise could hardly have been understood. And just as no one raises objections regarding proofs of this sort, even if during the course of them one is required to consider a sphere to be similar to a polyhedron, I likewise think I cannot be blamed here for using the analogy of an efficient cause in order to explain those things that pertain to a formal cause, that is, to the very essence of God. And there is no possible danger of error in this matter, since that one single aspect which is a property of an efficient cause, and which cannot be extended to a formal cause, contains a manifest contradiction, and thus is incapable of being believed by anyone, namely that something is different from itself, or that it simultaneously is and is not the same thing. Moreover, one should note that we have ascribed to God the dignity inherent in being a cause in such wise that no indignity inherent in being an effect would follow thence in him. For just as theologians, in saying that the Father is the principle of the Son, do not on that account grant that the Son came from a principle, just so, although I have granted that God can in a certain sense be the cause of himself, nevertheless, nowhere have I in the same way called him an effect of himself. For it is customary to use the word effect primarily in relation to an efficient cause, and to regard it as less noble than its efficient cause, although it is often more noble than other causes. However, when I here take the entire essence of a thing for its formal cause, I am merely following in the footsteps of Aristotle. For in his Posterior Analytics, Book 2, Chapter 11, having passed over the material cause, he calls the cause the what it was to be, or, as philosophers writing in Latin traditionally render it, the causa formalis, formal cause, and he extends this to all the essences of all things, since at this point he is dealing not with the causes of a physical composite any more than I am here, but more generally with the causes from which some knowledge could be sought. But it was hardly possible for me to discuss this matter without ascribing the term cause to God. This can be shown from the fact that when the distinguished gentleman attempted to do the same thing, I did by a different route. He nevertheless was completely unsuccessful, at least as I see it, for after using a number of words, he shows that God is not the efficient cause of himself, since the defining characteristic, ratio, of efficient cause requires it to be different from its effect. Then he shows that God is not derived from himself in a positive sense, where one understands the word positive to mean the positive influence of a cause. Next, he shows that God does not truly preserve himself. If, by preservation, one means the continuous production of a thing, all of this I readily grant. At length he tries to prove that God cannot be said to be the efficient cause of himself, because, he says, the efficient cause of a thing is sought only with respect to the thing's existence, but not at all with respect to its essence. But existing is no less of the essence of an infinite being than having 3 angles equal to 2 right angles is of the essence of a triangle. Thus, if one is asked why God exists, one should no more answer by way of an efficient cause than one should do if asked why the 3 angles of a triangle are equal to 2 right angles. This syllogism can easily be turned against the distinguished gentleman in the following way. Even if an efficient cause is not sought with respect to essence, still it can be sought with respect to existence. But in God, essence and existence are not distinguished. Therefore, one can seek an efficient cause of God. But in order to reconcile these two positions, someone who seeks to know why God exists should be told that one surely ought not respond in terms of an efficient cause in the strict sense, but only in terms of the very essence or formal cause of the thing. And precisely because in God existence is not distinguished from essence, the formal cause is strikingly analogous to an efficient cause, and thus can be called a quasi-efficient cause. Finally, he adds that the reply to be made to someone who is seeking the efficient cause of God is that he has no need of one. And to someone quizzing us further as to why God does not need one, the reply should be that this is because God is an infinite being whose existence is his essence. For the only things that need an efficient cause are those in which its actual existence can be distinguished from its essence. On the basis of these considerations, he says he overturns what I had said, namely, that were I to think that nothing could somehow be related to itself the same way that an efficient cause is related to an effect, I would never, in inquiring into the causes of things, arrive at any first cause of all things. Nevertheless, it appears to me that my position has not been overturned, nor has it been shaken or weakened. Moreover, on this depends the principal force, not just of my argument, but of absolutely all the arguments that can be put forward to prove the existence of God from effects. Yet virtually, every theologian holds that no proof can be put forward unless it is from effects. And thus, when he disallows the analogy of an efficient cause being ascribed to God's relationship to himself, far from making the argument for God's existence transparent, he instead prevents readers from understanding it, especially at the end where he concludes that were he to think that an efficient or quasi-efficient cause were to be sought for anything, he would be seeking a cause of that thing which is different from it. For how would those who do not yet know God inquire into the efficient cause of other things, so as in this way to arrive at a knowledge of God, unless they thought that one could seek the efficient cause of anything whatever? And finally, how would they make an end of their search for God as the first cause if they thought that for any given thing one must look for a cause that is different from it? The distinguished gentleman certainly appears to be doing the very same thing here that he would do were he to follow Archimedes, who spoke of the properties that he had demonstrated of a sphere by means of an analogy with rectilinear figures, and were to say, if I thought that a sphere could not be taken for a rectilinear or quasi-rectilinear figure having an infinite number of sides, I would attach no force to this demonstration, since, strictly speaking, the argument holds not for a sphere as a curvilinear figure, but merely for a sphere as a rectilinear figure, having an infinite number of sides. It is, I say, as if the distinguished gentleman, while not wanting to characterize the sphere, thus and nevertheless desirous of retaining Archimedes' demonstration, were to say, if I thought that the conclusion Archimedes drew there was some if I were if I thought that the conclusion Archimedes drew there was supposed to be understood with respect to a rectilinear figure having an infinite number of sides, I would not admit this conclusion with respect to the sphere, since I am both certain and convinced that a sphere is in no way a rectilinear figure. Obviously, in making these remarks, he would not be doing the same thing as Archimedes had done. On the contrary, he would definitely prevent himself and others from correctly understanding Archimedes' demonstration. I have pursued these matters here at somewhat greater length than perhaps the subject required, in order to show that it is a matter of greatest importance to take care lest there be found in my writings the least thing that theologians may justly find objectionable. Finally, as to the fact that I did not commit a vicious circle when I said that it is manifest to us that the things we clearly and distinctly perceive are true only because God exists, and that it is manifest to us that God exists only because we perceive this fact clearly, I have already given a sufficient explanation in the reply to the second set of objections sections 3 and 4, where I drew a distinction between what we are actually perceiving clearly and what we recall having clearly perceived sometime earlier. For first of all, it is manifest to us that God exists, since we are attending to the arguments that prove this. But later on, it is enough for us to recall our having clearly perceived something in order to be certain that it is true. This would not suffice unless we knew that God exists and does not deceive us. Now, as to the doctrine, that there can be nothing in the mind insofar as it is a thinking thing of which it is not aware, this appears to me self-evident, because we understand that nothing is in the mind so viewed that it is not so viewed that is not a thought or is not dependent upon thought. For otherwise it would not belong to the mind insofar as it is a thinking thing, nor can there exist in us any thought of which we are not aware at the very same moment it is in us. For this reason I have no doubt that the mind begins to think immediately upon its being infused into the body of an infant, and at the same time is aware of its thought, even if later on it does not recall what it was thinking of. Because the images of these thoughts do not inhere in the memory, however, it should be noted that although we surely are always actually aware of the acts or operations of our mind, this is not always the case with regard to faculties or powers, except potentially. In other words, when we prepare ourselves to use some faculty, if this faculty is in the mind, we are immediately and actually aware of it, and therefore we can deny that it is in the mind if we are unable to become aware of it. Reply to those matters that can attract the attention of theologians. I have opposed the distinguished gentleman's first group of arguments and have dodged the second group. At this time I completely agree with the arguments that follow, with the exception of the last one, concerning which I trust I will be able easily to bring it about that he will agree with me. Thus, I fully grant that the things contained in the first meditation, and even in the others, are not suited to the range of every intelligence. And whenever the occasion presented itself, I attested to this and will do so in the future. And this was the only reason why I did not treat these things in the discourse on method, which had been written in French, but reserved them instead for these meditations, which I warned early on should be read only by those who have both intelligence and learning. Nor should one claim that I would have done better had I refrained from writing about things the vast majority of people ought to refrain from reading, for so necessary do I take these things to be that I am convinced that without them nothing firm and lasting can ever be established in philosophy. And although fire and iron cannot be handled safely either by people who are careless or by children, still, because such things are useful for everyday life, no one believes that on that account we should do without them. But it is consistent with my works as a whole that, first, in the fourth meditation, I dealt only with the sort of error which is committed in determining what is true and what is false, but not with the sort of error that occurs in the pursuit of good and evil, and that, second, I always excluded those things that belong to the realm of faith and the practical conduct of life when I asserted that we should give our assent only to things we know clearly. And I also expressly made this point in my reply to the second set of objections, section 5. And I gave advance warning of this in the synopsis. The reason for saying this is to declare how highly I value the distinguished gentleman's opinion and how welcome I find his advice. What remains is the sacrament of the Eucharist, with which the distinguished gentleman believes my opinions are not in conformity, because he says, we believe on faith that once the substance of the bread has been removed from the Eucharistic bread, only the accidents remain there. However, he thinks that I do not acknowledge any real accidents, but only modes which cannot be understood without the substance in which they inhere, and hence that they cannot exist without it. I can escape this objection quite easily by saying that to date I have never denied real accidents, for though in the dioptrics and meteor, meteorology I did not employ them to explain the things I was dealing with, nevertheless I stated in no uncertain terms in meteorology, page 164, that I did not deny them. But in these meditations I was supposing that they were in fact not yet known to me. But I was not on that account supposing that there were no real accidents, for the analytic style of writing that I followed allows the supposing at various times of certain things that have not yet been sufficiently examined, as is evident in the first meditation, where I assumed many things that I disavowed later on in subsequent meditations. And surely I had no intention here of firmly establishing anything regarding the nature of accidents. Rather, I put forward merely those things about them that were apparent at first glance. Finally, one should not infer from my having stated that modes cannot be understood without some substance in which they inhere that I denied that they can be posited apart from their substance through divine power, since I totally affirm and believe that God can do many things which we are incapable of understanding. However, to proceed here more freely, I will not conceal the fact that I am convinced that everything affecting our senses is simply and solely the surface which is the boundary of the dimensions of the body that is being sensed, for it is only at the surface that contact takes place, and not just I, but nearly all philosophers, including Aristotle himself, affirm that sensation takes place only through contact. Thus, for example, bread and wine are sensed only insofar as their surface is touched either immediately by the sense organ or through the interposition of air or some other body or some other bodies, as I hold, or, as many philosophers claim, through the interposition of intentional species. However, we should note that this surface should not be reckoned exclusively on the basis of the body's external shape that our fingers touch. Rather, we should also consider all those tiny holes that are found both between the ground particles of wheat out of which the bread is made and between the particles of alcohol, water, vinegar, and dregs or tartar, which in combination produce wine. And the same thing holds for the very small particles of other bodies. For obviously, since they have various shapes and motions, these small particles can never be so tightly joined together that they fail to leave many spaces between them that are not empty but are filled with air or some other matter. Thus, when it is held up close to the eye, we see in a piece of bread rather large spaces of the sort that can be filled not just with air, but with water or wine or other liquids. And since the bread always remains exactly the same, even if the air or some other matter contained in its pores is altered, it is evident that these things do not belong to its substance. Thus the surface of the bread is not the one that surrounds the piece of bread as a whole, and that uses the shortest perimeter, but the one that immediately circumscribes each of its particles. We should note, too, that not only is this entire surface moved when the whole piece of bread is carried from place to place, it is also moved when some of the particles of the piece of bread are agitated by the air or by some other bodies entering its pores. Thus, if certain bodies are of such a nature that either some or all their parts are constantly being moved, which I believe is true for most of the parts of bread and for all of the parts of wine, we must also understand that their surfaces are in a certain continuous motion. Finally, it should be noted that by the surface of the bread or wine or some other body, I do not here understand any part of the substance or surely of the quantity of the same body, nor even a part of the surrounding bodies, but only that boundary which is conceived to be between the individual particles, and the bodies that surround them, and whose only being is purely modal. Contact takes place only at this boundary. Anything is sensed only through contact. Moreover, the substances of the bread and wine are said to be changed into the substance of something else in such a way that this new substance is completely contained within the same boundaries, within which the other substances were previously contained. That is, it exists in precisely the same place where the bread and wine previously existed, or rather, since these boundaries are constantly being moved, where they would be now, were they still present, it necessarily follows from these considerations that this new substance must affect all our senses in precisely the same way in which the bread and wine would have affected them had no transubstantiation taken place. But the Church teaches us in the Council of Trent, section 13, canons 2 and 4, that there takes place a conversion of the entire substance of the bread into the substance of the body of Christ our Lord. While the species of the bread remains, I fail to see here what could be understood by the species of the bread, except that surface which is in between the individual particles of the bread and the bodies surrounding them. For as has already been stated, it is only at this surface that contact occurs, and, as Aristotle himself acknowledges, all the senses, and not just the sense we specifically refer to as touch, sensed by means of touching, see his De Anima, Book 3, Chapter 13. Now everyone is of the opinion that species means precisely what is needed in order to affect the senses. Moreover, everyone who believes that the bread is converted into the body of Christ, at the same time thinks that this body of Christ is contained within the exact same surface as the bread would be, were it present. This is the case despite the fact that the body of Christ is there not in the proper sense of being in a place, but sacramentally, and with that type of existence which, although we are hard put to express it in words, and yet when our thought is illumined by faith, we can take to be possible for God, and we ought to believe this most resolutely. All of these matters are explained so aptly and correctly by means of my principles that not only do I have no fear that it will cause orthodox theologians to take even the slightest offense, but on the contrary, I anticipate instead that they will thank me greatly for putting forward in my physics opinions that are in far greater agreement with theology than the traditional ones. For certainly, as far as I know, the Church has never taught anywhere that the species of the bread and wine that remain in the sacrament of the Eucharist are certain real accidents that miraculously subsist by themselves, when the substance in which they inhered is taken away. But perhaps the theologians who first attempted to elucidate this question in a philosophical manner were so firmly persuaded that these accidents which move the senses are something real and different from a substance, that they did not notice that their position could ever be doubted. Thus, without any investigation of the matter and without any valid argument, they supposed the species of the bread to be real accidents of the same type. From this point on, they were completely involved in explaining how these accidents could exist without a subject. But they encountered so many difficulties in this project that, like wayfarers who wandered into a stretch of bad road and an utterly impassable terrain, they should have judged from their predicament alone that they had strayed from the right path. For first of all, they seem inconsistent, or at least those who do grant that all perception of the senses take place by means of contact, when they assume that something in the objects other than their disposed surfaces is needed in order to move the senses, since it is self-evident that only a surface is needed for bringing about contact. But if they do not grant this, they cannot bring to bear a single thing to this question that has any semblance of truth. Next, the human mind cannot think of the accidents of bread as being real, and yet as existing without the substance of the bread, without at the same time conceiving of these accidents after the manner of a substance. Thus, there appears to be a contradiction entailed in believing both that the entire substance of the bread is changed, as the Church believes, and at the same time that something real remains which was previously in the bread. For nothing real can be understood to remain except what subsists, and although it is called an accident, it nevertheless is conceived as a substance. And thus, saying that real accidents remain is in fact the same thing as saying that the entire substance of the bread is indeed changed, but that nevertheless the part of the substance which is called a real accident remains. And this, if not in words, then certainly in concept, entails a contradiction. And this appears to be the main reason why some have disagreed with the Roman Catholic Church on this point. But who denies that when we are free, and no theological or philosophical argument compels us to embrace other opinions, those beliefs are most especially to be embraced that could provide others neither the occasion nor the pretext for turning away from the truth of the faith? However, I believe I have shown with sufficient transparency that the opinion which posits real accidents is not in conformity with theological considerations, and in my Summa of Philosophy, which I now have here in front of me, it will be clearly demonstrated that this opinion is in total opposition to philosophical considerations. In that work, I will show how color, taste, weight, and whatever else moves the senses depends solely on the outermost surface of bodies. Finally, we cannot suppose there to be real accidents unless something new and quite incomprehensible is gratuitously added to the miracle of transubstantiation, which can only be inferred from the words of consecration. Consecration. Through this addition, these real accidents exist without the substance of the bread in such a manner that they do not meanwhile themselves become substance. But this is in conflict not only with human reason, but also with the axiom of the theologians who declare that these words of consecration bring about only what they signify, and who refuse to deem something a miracle when it can be explained by natural reason. All these problems are completely removed by virtue of my explanation of this matter. For far from my position needing something far from my position needing some miracle in order to preserve accidents after the removal of the substance. On the contrary, my position stipulates that they cannot be removed without a new miracle, namely, the one through which the dimensions are changed. Word has it that occasionally it has happened that in place of the consecrated bread, flesh, or a child appeared in the hands of the priest, but this is never believed to have taken place through the cessation of a miracle, but rather through a completely new miracle. Moreover, there is nothing incomprehensible or difficult in supposing that God, the creator of all things, could change one substance into another, and that this subsequent substance remains completely within the same surface within which the previous substance was contained. Nor again can one say that anything is more in conformity with reason, or is more commonly accepted among the philosophers, than the fact that not just every sense, but generally every action of a body upon another body takes place by means of contact, and that this contact can occur only at the surface, whence it plainly follows that a given surface must always act and be acted upon in the same way, even though the substance that was beneath it is changed. For this reason, if it is fitting to write here without giving offense, I have dared to hope this time will sometime come when the opinion that posits real accidents will be rejected by theologians as irrational, incomprehensible, and harmful to the faith, and that my opinion will be accepted in its place as certain and indubitable. I believed this should not be concealed here, so that I might do battle as best I can with the slanderous talk of those who wish to appear more learned than others, and thus endure nothing more unwillingly than when something new in the sciences is put forward for which they cannot claim for themselves any previous knowledge. It is often the case that the more they believe it to be true and of great importance, the more bitterly do they rail against it, and what they cannot refute with arguments they maintain is in opposition to the Holy Scriptures and the truths of faith. Without giving any reason, they are indeed impious when they desire to use the authority of the Church in order to overturn the truth in this matter. But I turn my appeal from these people to the pious and orthodox theologians, to whose judgments and criticism I most freely submit.